Good morning, everyone. Jim Laird joining you live from Grand Pacifica, Nicaragua. I hope you're doing well today. It's a beautiful day here. Um, Not as windy as it was yesterday, but I don't want to jinx myself. Had a great master class yesterday, or class with Dr. Stillman and I talked about basic strength training stuff. Kind of gave a framework for what is strength training. It's part of our fundamentals of wellness master class series that we do every week. Under Wellness Secrets. You can get in and watch those if you get on our email list. So just go over to stillmanwellness.com and do that. Dr. Stillman is doing a webinar tomorrow on basically how to do things a little smarter. The link is in the description. You can set a reminder. I believe it's at 11 a.m. Eastern. So that'll be good. You can tune in for that. I have a great question from the last live that I did, which was about essentially strength and conditioning. I had a question, and I put it in the description below, but it was from STW Man 5. I've heard a couple of college football coaches say they would rather have a guy that can overhead press 250 than bench 400. What is the reasoning for this? You may not agree with them. I don't know. It's a good assumption, a good question. And you mentioned losing rotation from lifting heavy. This is one of the reasons why traditional boxing workouts did not involve weight training. Honestly, that's the reason why a lot of sports would basically say that, if you lifted really heavy weights, you would get slower. And a lot of it depends on the sport. And if it's like side to side or if it's straight ahead, if you're an offensive lineman, you can almost get away with training like a power lifter, because the whole point of the is more straight ahead and not to get turned, right? So you don't want to turn as an offensive lineman, but there comes a point where you get so strong it affects your footwork, and the only really way to do that is kind of try, but you also have to know kind of the side effects of your exercises. Now, to basically cover your first question, and here's one of the weird things about being me, but also one of the disadvantages of being me. Like, you have people that like kind of specialize, like Cressy specializes in their baseball stuff. I've worked with professional baseball players. I have some experience with that. People like Dr. Mike Israel he generally specializes in hypertrophy. That's his niche. I've trained bodybuilders. I've got plenty of friends that are bodybuilders. I have a lot of experience training and working with bodybuilders, but that's not what I specialize in, right? I have experience working with golfers. I have experience working with professional baseball players. I've trained myself. I played college football. I've fought at a high level. I wrestled at a high level. But I've also made my money training general population. So I have such a wide array of subjects that I can at least give an opinion on. And probably to my detriment, I would probably be much better if I just picked a niche. Well, honestly, my niche was essentially training women was essentially my main niche. Believe it or not, but I haven't marketed myself like that, so to speak. So I just do what I do, and whatever happens. That's kind of the way I roll. So the reasoning behind this is like an overhead press. The football coach or college strength coach is going to be like, well, the stronger they are on their feet, the better, right? So that's the premise of that. Whereas the bench press is you're lying on your back. A bench press in powerlifting is a full body movement, and if you want to be really good at bench, you're going to drive your feet into the ground really hard and use your legs a lot. But I could see, why they would argue that a 250-pound overhead press is going to be better than a 400-pound bench. And it depends on how is that a strict press? Is that a push press? I mean, there's a big difference. But just having the balance to stand up with, that kind of weight over your head shows a lot of just stability, athleticism, whatever the words you want to use. But I'm also going to ask, how are they doing both of those things? Because that big aggressive arch on the bench if you use a big aggressive arch to get over your head, that can, really take away from getting in a good athletic position on the field. So I'm not a big when I work with football players, I think you have to have a decent bench press, but there comes a point if you got a 400-pound bench, I don't think you need to take it any further than that. There's plenty of ways to get stronger. I really like things like landmine or like hammer jammer presses for people like offensive linemen. What position is it? Wide receivers and people like that that involve a lot of cutting and moving. I'm not going to care so much about that stuff. Push press. I would be more concerned about a push press than a strict press. I like with football players, I like working end ranges of motion, particularly like with dumbbell press. I really like, we'll do some together, but I really like alternating dumbbell presses so that they're actually reaching, because when you're blocking in football, you're going to be in all sorts of weird positions, and you're not blocking with your shoulder blades pinned together like you do on the bench press, right? So I really like dumbbell presses. I think you should bench, but I also think you should do things where your shoulder blades are not aggressively retracted together, because that's going to basically, if you do a ton of that, that's going to take away over time your ability to move. And you could get away with it for a number of years, and then all of a sudden, the consequences come home to roost, right? Like a guy like David Boston, who used to be a really good wide receiver, and then he got a little too crazy with the bodybuilding and the lifting, and he actually lifted himself out of the NFL. That's a pretty good example of somebody who lifted themselves right out of the NFL. So, it all depends on who you're working with, but generally I just adjust the main lifts when I'm working with football players. I really like that kabuki bar. It's more of a neutral grip. When you're blocking in football, it's more here as opposed to here. I love landmines. I love things like that. They have a lot of these bars that you can put in the rack and you're pressing like with your whole body. So, and a lot of this stuff for linemen in particular is, being able to absorb the eccentric, controlling the eccentric, being able to absorb force with your hands, dynamic push-ups, things like that. So I've seen guys that were really good in the weight room and sucked on the field. I've seen guys that were sucky in the weight room, were amazing on the field. If I was gonna get myself, like, if I was gonna have attributes for a great football player, offensive lineman, I'd be more concerned about wrestling, how well I'd want them in wrestling or judo, or particularly Roman Greco wrestling. For an offensive lineman would be incredible. I'm going to look at that. Like, wrestling is essentially strength, like lifting the other person's body and controlling the other person's body. And then I would use the weight training to enhance the attributes that I've been wrestling. A lot of the kids that I've trained over the years that I've rehabbed were basically, they pushed the heavy weights way too quickly, and they just, really heavy box squats, like just throwing way too much weight on there, and they just basically, arch their back, use their spine to get these things done, and they end up hurting their back or they hurt their shoulder. They'd have been much better off doing lots of body weight stuff, or wrestling, or just basic, like, lighter strongman type things, events that are very doable for them, and then practicing their technique. I mean, you can be strong as hell and be a very crappy offensive lineman. I've seen it. When I was at Liberty, I had a coach named Joe DeLamiere who was he was on the Bills, played 12, 13 years in the NFL, never missed a game. He was not a big dude, but his technique was so amazing. He just schooled people. Like, he would turn his hat around backwards and get in the one-on-one drills with college guys and absolutely wreck them with no pads on, and just make them look like total idiots, because his technique was so amazing. So strength is important, but I overhead press and bench press. If I'm going to bench press football players, I would use a kabuki bar. I would probably elevate their feet slightly off the ground so they're not arching a ton. I would use a lot of floor press, because a lot of guys, the bench press is kind of an ego thing. But my skilled players, I would have them bench, but I probably wouldn't go crazy with it, because I want them to be able to move and flow. And there's plenty of lifting. They've got a lot of these machines now. Like, you'll see Cressy has it. It's like a machine that's like on a pendulum, and you can, press and do things like that explosively can't remember the name of it, but there's plenty of things you can do with cables. There's plenty of things you can do to get people to move better as well. And there's ways that you can do it so that you don't turn somebody into a giant tin man. And rotation from lifting heavy, as boxers, like having, you could do, like, somebody's a beginner, you could have them do like a 5-3-1 for a couple years, but then you're going to make sure, want to incorporate boxing practice, you're going to make sure to incorporate different things into that, so you're not just pushing lifting. And there's been some different athletes lift some really heavy things. Like Ben Johnson was very, very strong on the squat and the bench, and obviously he was, but he was more of an like a power runner. He wasn't like a Usain Bolt type. You took a Usain Bolt guy and tried to turn him into a powerlifter like you did with Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson was a short, stocky dude like me, but a lot shorter. Like taking Usain Bolt and trying to turn him into like this, heavy lifting monster would not go over well. So, but yes, boxers traditionally, they did not lift heavy weight because they thought it would take away from their ability to move, and there is some truth to that. So with boxers, I tend to do a lot of alternate presses, a lot of push-ups in different positions, lots of explosive medicine ball throws, things like that allow them to create force and move in different ways, not just the traditional pull downs with a hard arch. We're doing things that help them move as well as produce power. And there needs to be some general levels of strength in all the main movements, but I don't think it has to be as insane as people would think, right? So, and there's always going to be those outliers, of course, like you're really super, like your Barry Sanders, who squatted 600 pounds, and Barry was an absolute freak show. So, but that doesn't mean everybody has to squat 600 pounds in order to be a good football player, right? So that's not the only prerequisite. So the only way you really know is by trying. But I will say that you're better off you want to make sure that the position that you reinforce in the weight room is going to show up on the practice field. And it's the same thing with life as well. If you reinforce extension and a hard arch in the weight room when you go and train, don't be surprised when you find yourself in this hard arch position all the time. So you want to have some movement variability, right? And in certain sports, you're going to have to be required to go into positions that aren't necessarily ideal for long-term health, but you're going to make sure you have that variability. So if you are doing a lot of powerlifting and you're doing a lot of things where you arch, you're going to make sure at the end you round over a stability ball, you get into some flexion, you sit in a deep squat holding onto a post, you do some different things, some med ball throws, some more athletic. Chad Wesley Smith on his Instagram has got a lot of athletic things you can do as a powerlifter to help keep yourself healthy for the long haul, because that's really the name of the game. When you want to lift really heavy things, it takes decades to develop that. And if you rush that, it's going to end up causing issues for you. So I hope that answered your question. It was a great question. Make sure you get on our email list so you can get in on our class next week. Really appreciate you guys watching. I hope you guys have a great day, and tune in for that webinar tomorrow. I think you guys will enjoy what Dr. Stillman has to say. So take care. Have yourself a great day.